We're going to continue our theme on the inauguration. One of our own associates, Ian Von Son, is actually going to give us a little bit of a talk on the history of the inauguration. So, Ian, if you can unmute yourself and let's get Ian highlighted.
Hey, Ian.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, excellent. So, yeah, I work at SMA in the management consulting group, and we've got a lot to go over here, so I'm going to dive right into it. This is what we think of when we think of the inauguration. This is generally what it looks like. Exciting that it'll be the 36th Art Talk coming up, but next week will be the 59th presidential inauguration. Now, hopefully the picture will change here. Good. This is the first photograph taken of inauguration. This is Buchanan's inauguration in 1857. So they'd already been going on for quite a while by the time this happened. What's interesting about the inauguration, I think, is that it's all about celebration and kind of tradition and custom. So there are certain things that traditionally happen. The big one that we mostly think of is the inaugural address, partly because some of the most famous speeches given by presidents in U.S. history have been inaugural addresses. So it's an opportunity for the new president to explain the agenda, opportunity to make a first mark. So some particular memorable ones. A lot of people point to Lincoln's second inaugural as possibly the most famous. I mean, they're phrases that we all recognize. So Lincoln's, he said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." So very famous words. Another one is FDR's first inaugural. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And of course, JFK asked not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. So it's a very famous speech. One of the kind of more infamous speeches in inauguration history was also the longest. So William Henry Harrison in 1841. Unfortunately, this speech is what he's known for, not for the content, which everyone has forgotten, despite it being the longest speech going on for 2 hours, but more so because apparently, I guess because he was the oldest president elect at the time, 68 years old. He kind of wanted to give the impression that he was still quite strong, so he decided to, even though it was freezing cold, to do it without an overcoat and go on for a very long time to show his stamina, which backfired when he died 31 days later. And I wonder whether this remains the longest speech because no one wants to do a speech longer than that because of what happened to him. But it's unfortunate that you speak for so long and none of it gets remembered. So other traditional things that happen, there's the congressional lunch that happens directly after the event since 1953 in Congress, hosted by the leadership of Congress with the new president. There's the big parade, of course, which is kind of built around the first trip from the Capitol to the White House of the new president, which has a long history, has been kind of going back to pretty much the beginning. Here's a really interesting picture I saw of the inaugural parade with JFK. Don't generally look like this. I thought it was a pretty interesting Cold War image. And then, of course, there's the inaugural ball that happens in the evening. This goes back to 1809 with Madison. They had one ball, 400 guests. Today, there's many, hosted by many different groups, and the president bounces around to a few of them. Here's an interesting picture of one, the kind of setup, getting ready for one for President Garfield in 1881. At what was the Smithsonian's brand new National Museum, which is today the Smithsonian's Arts and Industries building. But so those traditions and centuries is what must happen. The inauguration. The only thing that must happen is that the president has to take the oath. So that's in the Constitution, Article 2. The actual words of the oath, they have not changed. It's exactly the same as it was at the first one. "I do solemnly swear or affirm," there's a choice, you can, what you want to say, "that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will to the best of my ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." Why is, and I think that the fact that this is the only thing that's required points to how important this is. It's also something that I learned that was quite interesting. The very first law passed by Congress after they came together for the first time, was an act on administering of an oath for members of Congress, which was similar. There was debates over the wording. Was signed into law by George Washington on June 1st. And it was very simple, just an oath to support the Constitution of the United States. That one has changed a bit over the years. The presidential one has not, since it's in the Constitution. But I think that points to how important this is and how serious they took it at the time. But as I said, that's the only thing that's required. Everything else is just sort of customs. Some of them going back to the very first inauguration. You can decide how you want the way that how they say the oath is something that is sometimes different. Although it's not really recorded, I guess it's generally thought that for a lot of the early history, the administrator of the oath read it, and then the president just had to say, yes, or I do, or something like that. Now they kind of have this back and forth where the administrator says it and the president repeats it, but it wasn't always that way. Most presidents have used a Bible, but that's not required, and not everyone has. It's usually administered by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but there's some exceptions to that, especially after an assassination when he doesn't happen to be around. So those are things that are not required, but generally happen just out of custom and tradition. So what I wanted to get to, which I think is pretty interesting, is the first inauguration. And this is sort of a depiction of it. In April 30th, 1789, George Washington's first inauguration in New York City. A lot going on around that time, which I think is always good to take into account. Around the same time, King George III, who had just fought a war against the U.S., was descending into a long episode of mental illness, which prompted a crisis over there. Georgetown University was founded in Washington, or what would become Washington. The mutiny on the Bounty happened in the Pacific Ocean, and later that summer, the French Revolution started. And it's interesting to think about. There was a French diplomat present at Washington's inauguration, and now just a couple months later, his own country was about to descend into chaos. But so this followed the first election. Electors were chosen in each state, and under the original rules, which is interesting to see how much stuff has changed, each elector cast 2 votes, and whoever got the most would be president. The runner-up would be vice president. It was pretty much everybody knew. It was more or less already decided that Washington was going to win. Every elector cast 1 vote for Washington, and then the second vote for someone else, and it was all divided up among a few candidates. But John Adams won for the runner-up by a pretty large margin. But no date was specified for the inauguration. This was left up to Congress. They decided to schedule it for the first Wednesday in March in 1789. And because of that, subsequently, for a long time, that happened to be March 4th that year. And ever since then, for a long time, March 4th was the traditional day until they decided to roll it back with the 20th Amendment in the 30s. But it turned out to be an especially cold and snowy winter. And many members of Congress were delayed in getting to New York, which was the temporary capital, which really points to how, part of the reason there was such a gap was just because of logistics back. All these people have to come together from around the country, and it didn't exactly have the best infrastructure at the time. So this was a real thing that had to be taken into account. So finally, everybody's there, April 6th, a month late. They tally the ballots. Then somebody has to go tell Washington that he won, has to go all the way down to Mount Vernon. And then Washington has to come back all the way from Mount Vernon, setting out on April 16th. So it's not, he doesn't get there until April 30th for it to actually happen. But it's quite interesting that it turns out to be there's a triumphal procession on his way there. Crowds and officials greeting him all along the way. He's deluged with honorary dinners and speeches, revelries, fireworks, bands. Partly, I think everybody wants to get in good with the new president, but also just sort of, I think, celebration that this is happening. And then what's really cool, April 23rd, he gets to Elizabethtown, and he takes the ceremonial barge that's been prepared for him across the river into Manhattan, rowed over there with a kind of little entourage along with him. And he's welcomed at Wall Street by the governor, the mayor, others. Again, parades, throngs of well-wishers. as he goes up to the residence that's being used as a temporary presidential residence for him. Lots of, but what we see here is a lot of celebration, pomp, and circumstance that continues to this day. Like that's just always been part of it. It doesn't have to be, but it's the tradition. And so he goes up to the building that I showed earlier, and I'll show another picture of it here again, to what had been New York City Hall, and it kind of been hastily remodeled by Pierre L'Enfant into a federal hall, so a home for Congress. And this is not the building that's known as Federal Hall in New York today, because this building no longer exists. But they sort of quickly put this together for the houses of Congress to assemble. Everybody's there. And then on the big day, church bells are ringing in New York, artillery salutes are firing, all these officials, New York State notables and diplomats from France and Spain are there. There's a military escort, full ceremonial procession, and he rides in a coach down to Federal Hall. Takes the oath from the balcony up there, which sort of, I think, starts maybe kind of another tradition of taking the, I mean, not everyone has taken the oath in public like that. Sometimes they've taken it, inside, but he did, and I think that is something that maybe is kind of carried over. Takes the oath on the balcony before a crowd, using a Bible that's been quickly borrowed, sort of a last-minute addition, and it's administered then by the highest judicial officer in New York State at the time. And then they return to the Senate chamber for his speech. So that's from the very beginning starts this tradition of the inaugural address, even though in that case it was not to the public, it was just to the members of Congress. Then they proceed to St. Paul's Church afterwards for a service, which is still standing, but looked quite different at the time. And then Washington goes back to the presidential mansion, which is this temporary building, to dine alone before coming out again later for evening fireworks and more celebration. So that was the first inauguration. The next one moves to Philadelphia, and eventually when everything's settled in Washington D.C., that's the first one is there with Jefferson in 1801. But as I mentioned earlier, the 20th Amendment kind of was the one that set the date as January 20th. No longer so much time needed to travel. It also kind of solves the problem of, if Congress has to set a date for the inauguration, they could, I guess, just not do it. But this kind of forces that to happen. But it means a shorter lame duck session. It just shorter gap between leadership. So yeah, just to wrap up, I think what's interesting to take away from here is the elements of the inauguration, the required oath, the customary speech, and then the traditional celebration that goes around it, just sort of celebrating the democracy, that elections have happened, a new government is in place, everyone is sworn to support the Constitution, the democracy, the laws, and kind of draws this nice line back through history to the beginning with Washington.
Thank you, Ian. That was absolutely fascinating.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.